everyone. Very glad you can all join us, and I'm very pleased to say today we've got Dr. Rachael Kent, which I think this is going to be an extremely interesting conversation. And I know when everyone says, oh, COVID and digital, you go, oh, but I think this is going to be really interesting because it's an informed conversation based on all the research that you have done. So, Rachael, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone so they know your background and what we're going to talk about today? That'd be really helpful.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Katrina, and hi everybody, and thank you so much for joining me. And yeah, understandably, when we think about 12 plus months now of living through lockdowns and living, predominantly through technology, through these lockdowns, we kind of have a sense of fatigue in this space. But I hope today's conversation and the research I'm going to be presenting is going to be insightful, will resonate, will certainly be relatable, I think, to many of you. And I'm going to be focusing predominantly on my COVID related research. So just to give you a bit of a background about me, I've been researching the impact of digital technology on our mental and physical health now for over 15 years. I'm an ethnographer, so I work with individuals in their everyday life to really understand this relationship from a very individual perspective, but then framing that through culturally, socially, what's going on in the world at that moment in time.
What did you call yourself again?
An ethnographer.
Oh my goodness.
So it's an extension of anthropology. So
Wow.
It's looking at the everyday events that we engage with as human beings and understanding, for me, the relationship between technology and health and how that influences how we understand health, how we perceive health, how particularly we look at health on social media platforms, the performance of health in different digital domains, and how that shapes and influences on our understanding of it. So yeah, ethnography is just a way of understanding how I research empirically. So working with individuals, doing evidence-based research, fundamentally to understand these tensions and negotiations and dynamics that all of us have been experiencing in a very intensified way for the last 12 months. And I'm also a lecturer in digital economy and society in the Department of Digital Humanities at King's College London. And I founded a digital health consultancy business called Dr. Digital Health. And I've popped in the chat and the links will be available as well. On my slides, you'll see my consultancy business where I work with individuals, businesses and employees to help them have a healthier relationship with their technology as we are all navigating this co-evolving space together. And so my work's been featured in a range of publications, which are all the links are available on my website. That's the best place to go to under press and publications. Places like BBC News and Forbes run as well, and a few different podcasts on there as well. If you want to dig in any more of my research, that's the place to go. And my first book will be published at the end of the year. I will explore the health self, this concept that I'm coming up with based on my PhD research, where I looked at how social media and self-tracking technologies influence how we manage health and how we share health online, and how that influences health behaviours in everyday life.
So, I mean, I was just thinking, so when you started your book, did you start your book before COVID or during? So, I mean, your work has presumably in the 15 years you've been doing this, it's sort of done a steady rise, and then it's suddenly gone like that, up Everest or something.
Exactly. The trajectory of our engagement with technology has completely accelerated and changed and evolved, and more so, of course, than in the last 12 months. And when I first started researching this area, I was looking more at how news media articles online were influencing health. Then we see health tracking coming in, consumer devices, Fitbit, Strava, then Instagram, and then now COVID with contact tracing and the digital saturation that we're living through now. So that's the kind of trajectory of my engagement with my lens and the ways in which that I historically contextualize where we've come to today.
And it is actually fortuitous. No, it's not fortuitous, isn't the right word. But the fact that something has happened like this, and the fact you're tracking it, will allow us, because I think we're all beginning to understand this COVID isn't a one-off now. I mean, I know we had that, the flu epidemic in 52 and whatever happened in the 20s, but I think this is going to become more commonplace, the issues that we're facing on a global scale of the impacts of health and all of those things. So by tracking it now, hopefully we're going to be in a far stronger position the next time something similar comes along.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I hope so too. And I think the lessons that we've learned we can take forward, and I'll be touching on some of those towards the kind of second portion of the structure of today's webinar. But I think also what's accelerated is the engagement of tech in so many different life domains that we were already using it in some areas. We get for sociality, communication, maybe doing a little bit of working from home, or certainly managing certain aspects of home, whether that be food delivery or whatever it might be via certain few apps. Whereas now we have a saturation of managing almost everything outside of the home via technology. And that's the kind of acceleration that I was just so fascinated when lockdown 1, now, almost exactly 12 months ago, happened. I wanted to identify and uncover and understand that immediate shift as those of us who are fortunate enough to work from home or be in the home, how we manage that space, because it was such a new, novel and evolving space of understanding, what is this pandemic? How do we respond safely? How do we look after ourselves safely? And how do we look after our families? And it was such a bizarre space. And I think we're now kind of starting to come to the stage where we understand the impact of the technology on that. And I'll be running through some of that data in today.
And I suppose, we've all been sort of embracing it one way or the other, whether we've liked it or not. But the pandemic has absolutely forced us to take it on board, but also highlighting actually where we put it, that we should be able to put it in a box, or we can categorize it so it doesn't merge over our whole world. And then I suppose the next step will be, what do we happen when somebody hijacks the internet totally? How do we survive? Because I know in our office that when there's no internet, everybody goes, well, we can't work. And we're not even on a production line where there's a lot of things sort of going on. So it's just multifaceted, the issues and concerns that will come out from the pandemic that has actually, well, I suppose it's put everything together in 5 years. I mean, it's shortened the lifespan of not the lifespan, but it's sped everything up, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And acceleration is the word that I often come back to. It's accelerated the integration of tech in so many different areas of our life. It's accelerated, businesses, many businesses stepping away from the kind of formal office environment to employees working from home. And many of the businesses I work with won't be going back into their offices. But what kind of the thing I'm most interested in, which I'll be talking about most today, is how do we as individuals navigate that saturation? How do we respond to a space which is not kind of ethically regulated? There aren't guidelines yet in place for this. We're figuring it out as we go along. And so my research has really been about working with individuals to understand that everybody is living through this pandemic under very different circumstances. So it's trying to unpack, well, what are those different circumstances, and how can we all have kind of strategies to manage the different pressures and strains that we're each facing every day. And it's hard for everybody, but in very different ways.
And it's not a level playing field, as nothing is, but this has certainly thrown out those highlights in society and things. So I know what we're going to do is Rachel's very kindly put together a presentation for us. So we are going to do slides, which is quite exciting because we don't often do slides. The other thing is, please do post your questions as we go along in the box at the bottom. I do have questions that people have already sent in as well, so hopefully we'll get through some of those. But just wanted to say that I was reading your Q&A thing on our website, article on our website, and I saw the word I'm never going to say it, digitalization. No, you're going to have to say it for me, as opposed to digitalization.
Digitization.
Digitization. How do you say it?
Digitization or digitalization.
Yes.
Yeah.
I could have probably guessed what those meant, but I'd never really thought about it. So I don't know if you want to explain to people, because it's one of those words that have come into our culture and we just go, oh yeah, we know what it means, but it's not. And it's really, I think digitization is the really frightening part in many ways.
So the kind of transforming of different ways that we can understand qualitative and quantitative health practices into digital formats is digitization. Also we can call datafication, and the datafication element is the value of that. So for those of us that might track our health with a step counter or a Strava running or cycling application or whatever it might be. It's that process of extracting value from the health data and the biometric, the individual data that we generate. Whereas digitalization, obviously, is the saturation of our engagement with the digital tools, products and services in our everyday.
Yeah, but the digitization, because I did go and look it up on Wiki, which doesn't mean it's necessarily true, obviously, but it's the changing of analog into digital, and that's the bit that, you know, is the concerning bit. And I think we do need to be concerned, because we gain in so many ways, but we also lose out on so many other things. But
absolutely. And I think the communication and sociality side of thing, and the mediation of that, is the opportunities but the problems that presents. And I'll kind of run through some of those now. But yeah, it is alarming. And also, you know, where the value comes in the process of digitizing the communication and the sociality, as well as our individual health data.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very concerned about. But should I load up my slides now?
I'll keep quiet now.
No, please interject. And if there's anything that comes up that you're kind of like have a bit of a question about, then please do interrupt me. So can you see that now?
I'm just waiting for it to go on full screen. There we go. Brilliant. Thank you.
Fantastic. So yeah, hopefully there's not too much of a lag. So yes, today I'm going to be presenting my evidence-based research from my COVID work, which I've touched on already, so I won't go over that again. But broadly, my research looks at how digital technology impacts our mental and physical health. And to anybody who's kind of watching this after the recording or now, please do give me a follow on Instagram on Dr. Digital Health. My website is up there as well. Please share any thoughts, reflections online, either with me directly or on social channels. That's much appreciated, and it's really great to hear your feedback and your experiences. And I'd like everybody to take a moment as well, before I kind of kick into the meat of the data and all the empirical work that I'm going to be talking about, to take a moment, which I won't allow a minute now because I know we're tight on time, but just to have a think about what the word health means to you today, and how your understanding and perception of health has changed since now 12+ months of COVID-19 restrictions and working and managing life from inside the home, but that mediation via digital tools. And I'll just leave that there for a second, but please do kind of have a think about this, and maybe this is something we can come back to guide our Q&A in the final portion of today. So I've run through my bio, so I'm not going to do that for you again. But what I would like to do is just give you an overview of the structure then. So we're going to probably spend around 20 minutes. I'll maybe try and cut it down to about 15 minutes now on the research, on presenting my empirical qualitative research, and then with some strategies that mirror the findings from my COVID-19 research project. So strategies to manage this tech saturation that we've been speaking at in the introduction, and tools for digital detox. And then the last portion, the last third of today's session, will be dedicated to a Q&A. So as Katrina said, please do jot down your questions and share them. Okay, so firstly, I always like to start any talk, any webinar, any events that I'm working on to kind of focus everybody's attention towards the fact that we are living in a digital society. And we've kind of touched on some of these points, but what I want to highlight here is that the world in which we are now living, whereas many of us might have used one or two apps or technologies or platforms to manage our daily life, whether that's health related or not, we are now, through COVID-19 crisis, living through the first pandemic of the algorithmic age. And what I mean by that is the mediation of so many different areas of our lives means that data-driven responses have really been the kind of priority of governments around the world, but also for ourselves individually to respond in the kind of healthiest and safest way possible to manage human life, to equip ourselves with the information that we need, whether that's kind of health information or practical information to keep ourselves safe from the virus, from the pandemic, or to keep our loved ones safe. And so this digital economy and all the different tools that we've started using in our everyday that has accelerated this expansion and adoption, we've had to integrate things, whether you're homeschooling your children, whether you're working from home, whether you're managing from inside the home with caring responsibilities, or looking after yourself with a chronic illness or disease, and managing all the different areas of life from inside the home. That mediating process means that we can't opt out of integrating so many of these technologies in our everyday. And this is just a few of what we are all now having to juggle, whether it's personal or professional. We're having to manage these in so many different areas of our lives. And so this digital society now, this shapes our understandings and our practices of health as well, because I don't see technology as separate to health. I see the impact very holistically on our mental and physical well-being. And this again has been accelerated because of COVID-19 and because of the isolation that we have all experienced in one way or another. And this is going to shape health and wellness for the future, for individuals, but also for the digital society, for our society moving forward. And I'll be running through some of these examples and the evidence-based research that's come out in relation to these, particularly on how do we juggle this saturation of all of these different tools in sometimes our everyday life, or sometimes in our every hour of the day. We're having to manage all these different areas. And so one of the key first findings to come to the fore from particularly the research I did in lockdown 1, but something that has stayed with us through lockdowns 1, 2 and 3, is this concept of toxic productivity. And this is arguably one of the most challenging converged and hybrid behaviours to emerge out of particularly the earlier lockdown phases, where we saw this cultural shift from FOMO, colloquially known as FOMO, but the fear of missing out, being replaced by a fear of not being or perceived as productive, which I am calling toxic productivity. And so this started very much on social media, as we saw people sharing certain lifestyle representations of managing, living in a lockdown, this kind of drawing of one's external network into the home, this increased intimacy and bringing one's network into our daily isolation practices. Whether we were sharing content on social media or not, there was a navigation and a almost a vulnerability of having insights into other people's home. And in quite a short space of time, this content on social media shifted from being very supportive, very empathetic of the mutual challenges that we were all facing, albeit under very different circumstances, which quickly mutated into personal growth and isolation content on social media. And this is where the toxic productivity started to happen. So we were learning a new language, trying to renovate our homes, becoming an artisan baker. I'm sure we've all seen enough banana breads to last a lifetime, and presented as this overnight achievable life goal. And so toxic productivity then became initially in the pandemic very celebrated as a way to signify success and happiness, personal transformation in the early phases of lockdown, despite the tragedy, of course, unfolding around the world. And the thing about toxic productivity is that it becomes such an embodied concept when we think about the relationship with technology and health. So we see other people sharing this content on social media, and they are performing this productive, healthy, moral, self-regulating citizen, being a moral citizen in response to the pandemic. But then that also plays into feelings of peer surveillance and peer policing, I also call it. So many of my participants spoke about when they were sharing health-related or lifestyle-related content on social media, they would get backlash from their personal communities online. So that would be friends calling them out from being outside of the home for too many times in one day, particularly in the first lockdown when we were only allowed out for that once daily exercise. And anything that signaled a kind of visible frequency outside of the home outside of that really enabled for these individuals a backlash and a peer policing from their social media communities. And so how this kind of evolved then outside of social media circles is this actually really did dictate and encourage people's health or lifestyle related behaviors. So people were almost scared to document being outside of the home too much for fear of the judgment and social backlash. And in turn, the stigmatization of the virus of COVID-19 became associated with those contracting it or presenting as symptomatic because of the judgment that, well, maybe you have behaved irresponsibly and therefore you deserve to contract the virus. And stigmatization is a very common centuries-old religious discourse. It actually started off in around the 17th century, which ties discursively together this idea about sinful behavior being equated with poor health. And we really saw this play out on social media. So much so that my participants actually would conceal diagnosis of the virus once we had the testing capabilities, and would certainly not want to be presenting as asymptomatic outside of the home or symptomatic at all via social media channels. And so it's quite an archaic way of looking at health and ill health, even in kind of the digital society of 2020 and now 2021. But we really did see a stigmatization of COVID-19 in the early phases of lockdown 1 and even into lockdown 2. And this normalizes judgments of other people, appointing this personal irresponsibility, a lack of self-regulation or moral code, which kind of justifies the role of the virus in somebody else's body. This idea that you must not be behaving responsibly and shielding yourself and keeping yourself safe and keeping your family safe was a real moral judgment that my participants spoke about extensively, of how much stress and anxiety this generated. And so how this kind of discourse was challenged then was the rise of content, visible content of people sharing stay at home hashtag, which really shaped how other citizens reacted to individual versus public behaviours. So we really did see social media becoming this judgmental sphere which influences individuals' lack of physical movement outside of the home. So people being scared to be out of the home so much, not just for fear of contracting the virus, but for fear of behaving irresponsibly. And so blame then became assigned ideologically to our own individual responses to the virus via the discourses we see being played out on social media and how much we were adhering to lockdown measures or not. And interestingly, an interesting finding I thought, which came from this area of the research, particularly in lockdown 1, was the different perceptions of individual agency and freedom. So how much we each individually perceived our sense of freedom in the geographic context of city kind of versus rural living. So those living rurally who I interviewed felt a greater sense of agency, freedom, desensitization from the virus. They felt they were more shielded from COVID-19, and those within cities felt far more heavily surveilled in their home via online social media representations, but also in terms of how fellow citizens navigated the city streets. So we see a kind of disparity then, of course, about the sense of freedom being played out and represented online, and then also suspicion towards others who don't conform to measures, whether that's suspicion depicted on social media or whether it's somebody maybe invading the 2-meter rule that we had or still have. But that kind of consideration to how do we manage and navigate the stigmatization and judgment online as well as offline as well. And they both fed into one another. And so with social media then, it's a performative space that ties into how healthy or unhealthy our own behaviours can be presented, but also how unhealthy or unhealthy other people's behaviours are. And we seem to pendulum between these two spectrums of social media. We use it on the one hand for creating intimacies, connections, and on the other, we kind of inhabit a lot of guilt and judgment over either not being perceived as healthy, having a fun, productive lockdown, but also judging other people's behaviours as well. And we also use it as a space for ensuring we are gathering health information. And whether that is misinformation or information, social media really was, in terms of the lifestyleization of COVID-19, a place where we would turn to for following influencers for health guidance, whether this kind of health guidance or lifestyle and well-being was attainable or not. And so through the kind of process of trying to understand the virus, trying to keep ourselves safe and healthy, we inevitably overloaded ourselves with technology, and now, of course, we are starting to understand the impact of that fatigue 12 plus months later and in our 3rd lockdown and hopefully final lockdown. And so in the past 12 months then, what has changed is how we understand our reliance now and saturation of digital technology on our everyday. But what has not changed is being able to disengage from our digital companions. And usage of our digital helpers has accelerated in so many life domains and has been habitually embedded in areas that we necessarily would not have used digital technology prior to the pandemic. So my research findings found, unsurprisingly, increased screen time, of course. And so now that reliance on digital devices means that we are trying to balance this pervasive saturation of screen time every single day. And the challenges to digitally detox within that space and to manage the melting pot of life from within the home. And for those of us who might have used 1 or 2 applications prior to the pandemic, we're now using tens of applications every day to manage our lives, to manage personal and professional commitments, caring responsibilities. And this kind of balance and division of roles all within the home, but creates that intensification of the melting pot of digital fatigue and the mediation of tech saturation. Of course, there are positives of the technology as well, and I'm always keen to highlight that in terms of the increased contacts that we've had with others. I mean, can any of us imagine what this pandemic would have been like without the use of digital technology? It is kind of unfathomable. And of course, it enabled us to build different networks, maybe connect with older friends or newer friends, develop new relationships. And interestingly, for those of us that have been working from home, my participants spoke about the diminishing of workplace hierarchies, which I found very interesting. So between more junior and senior staff members, the junior staff members found that working in the home and having lots of video conferencing meant that there was more of a democratizing of professional dynamics and exchanges, which was certainly a very kind of unanticipated finding of the research. But of course, we use technology fundamentally through the pandemic to equip ourselves with health information, and as a byproduct of that, misinformation. And because of algorithmic recommendations, we are being driven back to seek more guidance. And we saw this particularly in lockdown 1 as we are navigating the virus and understanding what it means for us in our everyday lives for the first time. And in turn, we had to navigate a tsunami of health information and misinformation, fake news and conspiracy theories, which always poses the question, to what extent can we rely upon public platforms and social media platforms in particular to manage our health, which has been an important question for now over a decade, but has certainly been accelerated through COVID-19, as we have this kind of collective unfolding of understanding what the disease is. And so wading through this wealth of health information and misinformation meant that most of us turned into medical lay experts. And I know that most people in this room are already medical lay experts, more than the general kind of member of the public might be. But there has now been that increasing broader public adoption of a medical gaze, ways in which we are each having a heightened understanding, certainly of what a virus is and how it is contracted. So we kind of binged on health information in a way that we might not have done pre-pandemic, equipping ourselves with enough information to manage these stresses and strains. But of course, this generated a huge amount of anxiety. And so in turn, through this kind of overload of tech tools to understand the virus, we identified very compulsive traits and behaviors through the increasing integration of tech in our everyday lives. And if we think about the move into lockdown 2 and now 3, technology addiction and compulsion is something that I think most of us can identify with to a certain degree. And it's a really challenging concept, tech addiction, and the appropriate language and clinical terminology is still being, it's still not agreed upon in terms of the kind of linguistic barriers and psychiatric barriers. But I like this quote here from the Journal of Psychiatric Research because it highlights tech addiction in a way in which I think that most of us can probably identify that we do exhibit some established traits that align with these traits of addiction that we might see here. Things like salience, preoccupation, mood modification, tolerance and withdrawal in particular for tech addiction. And I think that in digital societies, it's become kind of culturally assumed and expected that checking our devices is very compulsive. This is just a part of everyday life. But we need to recognize that these practices are similar to established addictions that we see here listed on the screen. And it's important to identify individually which parts of these listed addictions here or symptoms of addiction you might be experiencing with your technology use in everyday life. And so interestingly then, just digital detoxing as a kind of blanket term or practice doesn't necessarily just remove addiction. And it means different things to different people. And an interesting finding from my research was about how those that did try and quit for a certain period of time found themselves being drawn back to the tools and actually felt a lot of guilt and responsibility to not only their social media communities or online communities or family and friends they might speak to via WhatsApp, but also to the devices themselves. And so we can see here, I've just included a quote from one of my participants, which I think many of us might be able to identify with or relate to at some stage of our relationship with technology. But we can see how digital society we have an expectation of convenience with these digital tools, but this is weaponized temptation. And it's this weaponization of temptation that we have to individually manage and self-regulate, which is a very, very difficult space in a pandemic when we're all isolated and living to an extent, a way of quarantined life. And of course, we are drawn back into these devices. They are built, the techno-commercial infrastructures draw us back into their use. They are designed with a consideration to how it economizes attention. And so it's a very obsessive but mesmerizing process of surveillance. So what is digital detox then? What does this mean for us individually as a concept or as a practice? It's a very umbrella term. It's thrown around a lot these days, and it means very different things to different people. And in lockdown, the digital world is a lifeline for many of us to enable sociality, to enable our connection with others, to maintain our intimacies with the important people in our lives, personally, but also perhaps professionally as well. And we can't opt out. We can't just cut it out. And I think it's useful to think about our relationship with technology as an extension of our physicality, not to celebrate that extension, but to be critical about it and understand the pervasive connection with it. As we mediate communications and interaction outside of the home almost entirely via these very habitual tools. And so we need to identify when social media compulsion or technology fatigue are damaging to our everyday, to create that critical and reflexive relationship towards it, which is incredibly challenging in the current climate of our mediated and quarantined lives. So how do we balance engaging with and mediating our lives via a screen when we can't simply cut it out? And I argue in my work that we need to objectively redefine for ourselves what our goals are with our digital health. What will a detox actually achieve for us individually to ensure we can make actionable and longer term changes to our relationship with technology? And simply going cold turkey doesn't yield positive results. As I've got a quote here from one of my participants, it often generates a feeling of neglect towards online networks and devices. So it's about recognizing when the emotional mediation becomes addictive and compulsive and when it feels damaging towards our mental and physical health. And before I move on to the strategies then that I've put together for today in relationship to the issues that I've just outlined, this is kind of my philosophical kind of musing, I suppose, on digital detoxing and technology then, that they hold such persuasive power over our everyday lives. And so there's a sense of a duty towards their integration as well as a necessary integration. But we need to identify when we start to use technology in a way that distracts from personal goals, personal gratification, and perhaps, I think, most worryingly, personal experience. And then in the second portion, I've got some strategies that I can run through. But I don't know whether, Katrina, you wanted to jump in at any stage now, or if you'd like me to continue running through the strategies.
Of course I do. Of course I want to jump in. I've got questions. Yeah, I'm interested in, because I think you said it was qualitative research that you did, and qualitative obviously means, well, I always think of qualitative as being quality, so you're not taking the masses, you're doing smaller numbers of people that you're talking to individually. Can you tell us, how many numbers and who they were? I mean, I saw that you'd got 28 female, but of
Yeah,
women?
absolutely. So this research, so it's combining my PhD work, which was working with 14 participants for 9 months to understand their relationship with technology. And then with the COVID-19 research, it was again 14 participants, and both age ranges were very similar. It was, for my PhD work, it was 26 to 49 years of age. And for this, and the COVID-19 research, it was 26 to 60. And that was split evenly, male and female. And these were individuals who were dealing with chronic illness and disease, to the everyday layperson, to those wanting to kind of reach certain health goals, to those who weren't particularly interested in kind of optimizing their body, but just the everyday user of technology. So the only kind of prerequisite was that they would engage with technology in some way in their everyday life, whether that was professionally, personally, or both.
Okay. And I mean, I find it quite interesting, or we find it, because obviously we look at all our, so we Talk Health is totally online, our platform is online, and then we have 3 social platforms, four actually, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And there's a huge buzz around health on Instagram, but those are the ones that are generally the influencers.
Mm-hmm.
And people will know from listening to many of our webinars is that I'm very skeptical and concerned about health influencers. I think they're more of a minus certainly than a plus, because it's so easy to say that you've got credentials, or you don't even say you've got credentials. If you've got a lot of people following you, it must be true what you're saying, which we know
it's problematic.
It's real rubbish. So the people on your survey or in your research, what did you do? Were they using Instagram, for example, or were they using those? So did everybody, or were there people not using those platforms?
Everybody I've spoken with over my PhD research and my COVID research has used influencers on social media, and influencers who have no health qualifications or credentials whatsoever, as a form of health guidance. And this was really accelerated in COVID-19 when in lockdown 1 particularly, when we were all navigating, what does this virus mean? How do we respond? How do we live? How do we keep healthy? How do I keep my family safe? They really were using the influencer cultures as a guidance, which was incredibly problematic. And I have a lot to say about the lack of regulation of health content on Instagram, because I think it's really worrying and very damaging to our potentially to our mental and physical health.
I mean, I am very pleased to say that when we run our coffee mornings and things like this on Talk Health, which is really about, and that's one of the big things about digital, is you don't want it to take away the face-to-face. So although we're doing it digitally, it's so important to see somebody's face and have a conversation as opposed to typing something, isn't it? And that a lot of our members actually aren't on not necessarily social media, because I think a lot of them might be on Facebook, but just where people still use Facebook for genuine friends, people they genuinely know and look and of interest, as opposed to Instagram, where most people you don't know, most people you follow at all. That's the whole. That's what it seems to be now, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And there is that difference in terms of what social media channels we use now for what purpose. And on Facebook, I think it's perceived now as a more intimate, private space, and Instagram potentially more of a context collapse, we call it. So you have people from all walks of your life, every area in your life, as well as many other people that you may not have known or met. I mean, and that's the increasing commercialization of the platforms, the techno-commercial infrastructures. Ultimately, I think Instagram has kind of developed into its own beast, particularly over the last 5 years. And I think that content that is kind of publicly available, the influencers with a certain amount of following will get the engagement metrics, will get that attention because they've got X amount of followers but no health qualifications. I think we need to have a way to qualify who is clinically able to actually give health guidance via these channels.
Yeah, but if you look at what's happening, yes, 100%, one should have some form of certification on your screen to show you are a trustworthy source. But if you take a step back, we are members of something called Patient Information Forum Accreditation, which means that the information that we post on our website, when we put a little tick box against it, shows that it is evidence-based. Now, most charities in the UK and people provide, definitely obviously the NHS, people who provide information on health will have that accreditation as we do.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's taken such a long time. You know, it started off being under NHS's wing. They then moved it under NHS Choices, I think it was, and then they moved it on to PIF, which is a great organisation. You know, just the written word, so that when you go to the doctors and you're given a leaflet, it has that tick to show this is true. I mean, God, how long on earth is it going to take for something digital to have that accreditation, which is frightening?
Exactly. I mean, Facebook, I think it was 2 weeks ago, have now started removing anti-vax content. I don't know if you're aware of that. There's literally 2 weeks ago, they've actually managed to start regulating and moderating that content. That's 2 weeks ago, and we're 12 plus months into the pandemic. So, you know, this is how long, I mean, that has obviously been accelerated given that we're in a pandemic. If that hadn't happened, I don't think that regulation would have come in at all. That wouldn't have been a priority for Facebook. And obviously Facebook also means Instagram, of course. So, you know, it does take a long time, because it is a very difficult space to regulate when it's not geographically bounded, you know, based on, you know, being such a global platform.
Yeah. But I mean, I suppose what we're sort of saying is maybe we should get some petition going, is that we're not looking to ban anything. All we're looking to do is to find some form of accreditation that you can show that if you see that accreditation, you know it's from generally an evidence-based, trustworthy.
Exactly. Yeah, Sophie Medlins at City Dietitians, she did start a petition in recent months about this, actually, that it was to do with nutritional information. But
I'll have to get, because Sophie's been on a couple of our webinars, and that she's very passionate about and so knowledgeable about her subject area, which is great. So yeah, we ought to really, I feel very, very strongly about that. And it's interesting, isn't it, when you listen to certain things on television or whatever, they say, particularly last week, I think, when they were talking about, you know, the people who do committing suicide, and they were talking about, if these are the triggers, you know, they mention the triggers. So if you do have those triggers, don't watch it, basically. I suppose that's what they're saying. So there's something, and also in films, when they say there's going to be some flashing lights, they tell you in advance. So that's the similar type of thing I suppose one's looking for.
Yeah, absolutely.
It happens in other ways. So one other thing, Rachel, before I you know, while I'm taking the limelight again, what I just wanted to say is, what's interesting also is that it was around August, I think, September last year, that people really started to realise there was a problem with social media and they needed to have a break. And I thought that's great. There was a number of people saying, I'm now coming off social media, and I thought this is like a really good trend.
Yeah.
But it's not lasted.
It hasn't lasted, no. And this is what what I've mentioned about digital detox, is just kind of coming away from it, or making that blanket mass kind of switch off. That just isn't possible anymore.
Yeah.
We're working from home or not, but in terms of all of us living in, you know, in a very isolated lockdown or some form of restriction in the UK, you know, it's incredibly challenging. We can't just switch off. However, you know, I can run through some of the strategies in a moment about things that I think are good to implement to make sure that if you are feeling saturated, if you are feeling anxious and stressed and comparative about your lifestyle, and social media is a big part of that, then things to do to help you with that dynamic to navigate, because it's something that we all experience if we're on social media, that we're all having to kind of navigate and juggle, because it does give benefits too, you know, there is benefits to it. But I think it's about being very critical and individually aware of when it's starting to damage on particularly your mental health. Okay, so do you want to kick on again? I'll kick on again, and I'm going to have to jump through this a little bit, but I'll be focusing. Where have you gone? It crashed. Ooh, sorry. There we go. Okay. Well, it's because it's there, right? We can't see it yet. No, it should be arriving shortly. How is that now? Oh, we're just waiting. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to ping through what I think are the strategies that will be most useful given our conversation. So first of all, thinking about kind of the digital economy broadly is always to think very, very consciously about only signing up to applications and platforms you need to. Of course, there's an application for everything these days. And if you do sign up to something that you only use once, remember to delete it so that when you go on your phone, you're not just saturated by that kind of digital noise visually when you actually look at your phone. And try and do that every couple of weeks. I call it a digital cleanse of my phone or of my devices. And to remember fundamentally as well that the attention economy is inbuilt in all of these platforms we use every day. So just to be really aware and conscious of that when it's trying to coerce you and pull you in and distract you from your life and from your immediate goals, try and be very critical about that and think, no, right, you can see it happening. You're falling down a rabbit hole on YouTube or Instagram or work emails or whatever it might be, and to try and disrupt that process. Competition and comparison, and this comes back to things we were just speaking about, but I think it's really important to be present about your feelings when you are online. So if you're scrolling on social media and it's making you feel comparative about your lifestyle in any way, if that sense of feeling damaging to your self-esteem or sense of self, unfollow that individual and put your phone down. We don't need to be reminded of other people's lifestyles if it serves to make us feel bad about ourselves. So really, really try and be conscious and intentional about when you are on different social media platforms in particular. One thing around surveillance and privacy, I think it's really important to ensure privacy settings are as comprehensive as possible and to turn off your GPS tracking on your apps as well. And something that I would always recommend is that also when you are having time away from the screen, to turn off your notifications or turn off your 3 or 4 or 5G so that you're not getting nudged and you're not going to habitually go on to, say, Facebook, Instagram, work emails, to try and kind of create that division and make it a little bit more difficult for you to get into the habitual scrolling that we all so easily do. This always on culture that has developed and been kind of intensified in the last 12 months, of course, makes us stressed. And when I say the always on culture, I mean always being available. So that can just be being available on WhatsApp, being available on the phone, being available to your friends and family at any time of the day, because we aren't in necessarily a workplace, or we aren't doing lots of different things. We don't have busy lifestyles at the moment in the way that we once did pre-pandemic. So I try to encourage people to have screen time, to minimize screen time, try and not have screen time immediately before bed and first thing in the morning, and to minimize news scrolling. And again, these social media lifestyle comparisons that make us feel very comparative about ourselves. So tech compulsion and addiction. The fundamental thing I always try and advocate is to remember that your phone, laptop, tablet is not your friend or companion, and your support network are those that nourish us in our everyday lives. And being intentional about when you pick up your phone. So what I try and do is bank the things I need to do on my device, rather than pick up my phone every time I need to send an email, send a WhatsApp, create a post on Instagram, check Twitter, do some networking, whatever it might be, catching up with friends, is to try and bank 3 to 5 things I need to do on my phone at any one time. So I'm not picking up every single time I need to do something, because inevitably you then do one thing which leads on to another, and before you know it, you've lost 20 minutes, and that can happen 10, 20 times in a day. Another thing is to delete emails, particularly work emails, off your phone, so you don't end up sat on your sofa late in the evening emailing when you should be trying to have some time away from the screen. And the biggest of all, of course, is digital detoxing. But this isn't about just mass cutting out of devices. This is about creating boundaries between labour and leisure technologies. So one tip that I give is to enable different devices for labour and different devices for leisure if you can. Or even on your phone, grouping the applications that are for labour. So that might be things like food delivery, that might be things to do with homeschooling your children, that might be things to do with fitness. We can put fitness or health management under labour, and then have a different folder for leisure technologies, things that serve you, things that nourish you, personal interest and hobbies, and to try and create those divisions, because everything is mediated via the screen right now. So it's really, really hard to differentiate the blurring of the labour and leisure via these devices. So try and create those divisions for yourself in whichever way you determine labour and leisure for you. And having whole days, and I personally take Sunday often as a whole day away from my device, or 2 to 3 evenings a week where you're not engaging. And also to try and, if you are going outside of the home for your walk, and that seems to be what most of us are doing these days, that's the only thing we can really do is go for that walk, is to not take your phone on you if you can. Or if you do have to take your phone on you because of family, reasons, commitments, turning off your data to avoid habitually scrolling is a really, really useful tool to ensure that when you look at your phone, you don't have notifications or you don't end up slipping into a rabbit hole of scrolling. And just fundamentally turning off your notifications for everything. So when you check your computer or phone, you are actively and intentionally deciding to engage, because we know that we get the dopamine kick when we get an email and when we get a WhatsApp or when we get a like on an Instagram post. And that is nudged and notifying to us. But when we don't get it, it serves to make us feel a sense of void or a sense of lack of personal gratification. And so if we can be more in control of when we choose to get the dopamine kicks and when we choose to actually engage with the notifications, then we are having more control over the device rather than the device being controlling and coercive or nudging towards us. So it's about reframing that relationship so that we are intentional about when we pick it up, for when we're ready to read a message, when we're ready to engage with a work email, rather than the other way around. Packing away your home office on the weekends, if you don't have a separate space, is a really, really useful way as well to kind of disengage on evenings and weekends. And on digital detox evenings or weekends, I call it going analog. Try and do something like picking up a book or exercise from memory. even not doing a yoga class via a YouTube instruction video, for example, helps draw you into your body more. Because when we're using that tool, we're using that technology to mediate it, it's still a distraction, it's still digital noise. If we're doing something just from memory, we have a very different relationship to the process of doing it and to the ways in which we actually experience switching off and relaxation. Influence on personal relationships. And so much of my research has highlighted how much digital distraction causes problems in our personal and professional relationships. And so as a reminder, always think about whose attention keeps you nourished emotionally and keeps you warm at night. And of course, we know it is not our phone, even if our phone might be with us until we go to sleep. So it's trying to create those barriers, trying to create and those divisions and boundaries with the technology. Long-term versus short-term effects. It takes 14 days to break a habit. And this is about being disciplined, trying to kind of break up that habitual relationship with technology. But if you do slip up on a digital detox evening, just remember that all you can do is try, identify the benefits of where you felt what was good disengagement, acknowledge the setbacks, and then keep trying to have a healthier relationship with technology. No point beating ourselves up about this or feeling guilty or shameful. Just thinking about this as a process of learning and a process of readjusting your relationship with the technology and resetting those habits and changing the habitual neurological pathways. The more we do something, the easier it gets. I think that it's also incredibly important at the moment to remember that our perceptions of who we are or who we're not can be our biggest inhibitors. So to remember that try not to get distracted by lifestyles on social media, or whether we're tracking our health or fitness via certain health tools, or falling into kind of rabbit warrens of understanding, trying to kind of understand more about certain health related content or health guidance, particularly in the context of COVID. We are not a data double. We are not the representations of ourselves we see online. Also, the people we see online are not the representations of who they are in their everyday life. And it's important to remember that lifestyles online, identity online is an idealized representation of self. It's not a true depiction of reality and of who we are. We are not data doubles. And coming to the end then, be reflexive. At the end of each week, think about which technology habits helped, served and nourished you and which made you feel worse. And to remember that we're still co-evolving with technology and the pandemic. Our needs and desires have changed over the last 12 months. And so in turn, your technology use can satisfy personal and professional transformations, and that they will change. There might be certain practices that once served you that no longer do. So try and be conscious and reflexive about that process. Pandemic or no pandemic, we don't need to be relentless, optimal, productive beings, focusing always on toxic productivity. And I think it's so important when we think about re-socialization as we look forward to hopefully coming out of this lockdown and managing the strains on our mental and physical health that might generate in the future, given that we've been all living very kind of isolated quarantine lives, that the relearning to socialize and the relearning to have a different relationship with our technology will take time. And I think we need to be very conscious that we are living through a global and national trauma, which makes us anxious, depressed, lacking in motivation and concentration. And we are in that permanent state of trauma. So we need to be kind and gentle with ourselves. So tech then shifts definitions of health and ill health, activity and inaction, presentation and consumer surveillance and privacy. And I think that as we kind of come into this, I think nationally quite reflexive period of 12 months of lockdowns, and as we see the end in sight potentially of easing of lockdown restrictions, it's really important to remember that we have learned so much in the last 12 months about our mental health, our physical health. And I think just as a final, hopefully positive point, I want to just draw everybody's attention to thinking about what we have learned and the things that the last 12 months of COVID-19 and lockdowns, what they have taught us. And fundamentally, I think it's about turning those attentions towards the grateful things that we've been so beneficial, and the small nourishments that we've had in our everyday lives that we can be provided with, that aren't always mediated by technology. Sometimes they can be, but I think it's turning the attention towards those small nourishments and then hopefully bringing that with us into the re-socialization that we're going to be experiencing in the coming months. So I hope that we can try and take those positive learnings with us into the next coming few months as we come out of this phase. And I will leave it there.
Brill, thank you. There was just so much.
It's a bit of a rush through at the end, but hopefully.
Yes, that's you talk. What I would really like us to do, if that's okay with you, is to take, well, I think that, you know, as you said, there are two parts, but definitely the strategies at the end, if we may take those from you and turn them into an article, obviously credit to yourself, and put them onto our website for everyone to share. I know that lots of people do look at the videos afterwards, but sometimes you just want to get those quick hit bullet points to remind yourself about the, you know, and one would look through those and think, oh, well, that's obvious, isn't it? Turn it off or do this and that. But you just need to sometimes be reminded and see it written down again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it. It's about making those small changes. And also you feel very empowered once you kind of reset those kind of compulsive or habitual practices. And then that feeds into you then changing and adjusting other habits, because you're like, oh, that worked actually. That really small adjustment of having an evening off any digital device really, really did make me feel refreshed, and I slept better. And I woke up the next day feeling less comparative about my lifestyle or less fatigued by the screen. And so I think it is those small adjustments that cumulatively do make changes to how mentally and physically healthy we feel.
Yeah, and I think helping yourself is really important. I'm very lucky that I have a study that I can work in. So I make sure that I close all my notebooks, all my work. I don't leave it scattered on my desk. I put that away so that if I do come to my laptop, which I really try not to go on during the weekend, but if I do, I'm not tempted just to sit down and go straight into my work environment that's all around me.
Absolutely. And these are the kind of habits, the healthy habits that we can use, even just so much as closing your laptop screen. You know, little things that are small adjustments, but as you say, closing the door, or for those that don't have a home office, you know, pack it away. And if you can do it every evening, fantastic. Obviously that's time consuming, so you can do whatever you can within, you know, the time frame you have available. But I think that these are so, and even putting your laptop in a different room, you know, just little things like that, so that you have the mental headspace to really switch off is so important.
I'm just having a quick look at questions because we're going to run out of time now. So someone said, I'm doing more running in lockdown, thinking about health apps like Strava. Is there a point that you can become too obsessed with personal health data collection?
Yes, absolutely. I've written about this quite a lot actually. So for a longer response, go and have a look at some of my publications on this, which are all linked to my website. But absolutely, and my key bit of advice is to trust human instinct over the data accumulation. So if your Strava app is nudging you to go for a run when you don't physically feel able, do take that moment to instinctively think how your body feels, because it's very easy just to follow the nudges of a device to run further or run faster via the kind of parameters in which you might have set. And that doesn't serve to make us mentally or physically healthier, you know, and we're going to be over exercising our bodies in a way which is potentially very physically damaging. So always trust human instinct over the device. That's not to say they can't be incredibly supportive and motivating. They can, but it's a very careful relationship to kind of navigate. So to be really conscious about when it feels compulsive and you're responding to the nudges of the device.
I think, you know, with all the health apps, obviously there's so many health apps, blah, 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 blah. But the ones that I think are really good, particularly when you've got a chronic condition, are ones that record. So when you use it in a positive manner for what it was built for, so that if you're recording, say for example, eczema or, you know, I don't know, periods and all of those sorts of things that because you think you remember, but of course you never do. And if you've got something there solid like this might have been my trigger food or something like that, it's all there. You can see it and you can take it to the doctor to have a meaningful, you know, conversation to really improve your health. Now that's what I call an app really helping you and supporting you.
Absolutely. And you have that kind of logged narrative, that logged depiction or identification of symptoms, something that's there that in the moment you can keep track of, that's so beneficial and helpful. Absolutely. I mean that's the best use of a health app in my argument. I think absolutely. It's the blurring of the medical and the consumer applications that's the problematic ones.
Totally. Now, of course, I've now gone and lost the ones that we had emailed in. I had them on a nice piece of paper and they've gone. But having said that, we have actually run out of time.
I know, sorry, I probably spoke for too long in the end.
No, it's because I interrupted you, don't worry. So, Rachel, thank you so much for coming. It was really, really interesting. And, you know, as I said, I'd really liked for us to create some articles from the information you've given us, and that's great. So,
yeah, I would love to. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great. And yeah, I'll put something together and put some strategies together, some bullet points I think would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you everybody for attending. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.